What we're going to do today is to look at what it's like around the world, how do companies react, and more importantly, what are some of the ways that we can think about the future. I think this is an extraordinary time and demands very different response the way we think about this issue uh, than in the past. So, for instance, if you think for a moment, right now, particularly in the United States, everyone is focusing on bending the curve. Why bending the curve is so important? Because, for instance, in New York City, they are anticipating this very week will hit what the government Cuomo would describe as the apex of the situation. They foresee there would be a peak in terms of infection. There would be a peak in terms of the requirement in healthcare and so on. So right now, pretty much the media is focusing on almost like primarily the mitigation. How do we make sure our healthcare system can cope with such response? But as you can see on the top, on the bottom right-hand corner, once we climb beyond the mountain, doesn't mean that business would return quite yet. If we want to understand how Europe or US would look like, one can think about and look at into Asia as well. What we've seen in Asia, whether it's Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, or China, we have seen a second wave of coronavirus cases pretty much over the course of the last 2 months continually. And that has created a lot of anxiety, particularly in here in Asia. And today, if you look at the bottom post down there, in April the 6th, just like Monday, the Singapore government basically have described we're gonna go into the lockdown again. So my colleagues in Singapore have described they're gonna close out the cinema, they're gonna close out the restaurant again in order to cope with some of the rising case. Now, fundamentally, this is a biological crisis, and some expert already said the only way to make sure we are really able to return to business is the emergence of a vaccine, which of course will take time. And some people would say it takes at least 18 months. Now, whether this is a process can be accelerated through finance, through the ingenuity from Silicon Valley to Shenzhen, we are not quite sure yet. Which is why the way we think about the future requires some kind of option thinking. Now, from that angle, I'm going to pass on to Salvo to think about how can we think it through in terms of the future, rather than hold on to one particular dominant paradigm or scenario. You can think of this issue much more in a multiple form, so that you as a team or an organization can react much more in a holistic way. So Salvo, I'm going to pass on to you now.
Thank you so much, Howard, for this excellent introduction, and just a way somehow to put a little bit of microeconomic framework to what Howard is going to explain later on about the end, or at least rethinking about bureaucracy, okay? We have been seeing lately that the economic contagion is spreading as fast as the virus itself. And I don't have to tell you, like, you know, I'm sure that all of you are somehow knowledgeable of what is happening in the stock market. I remember a couple of years ago, actually was in AMP, which is one of the programs run by Howard. I think it was the second day, and Apple that day actually dropped $150 billion in one single seat. And all the big four giants, tech giants, lost about $200 billion. So I don't know if you remember that day, Howard, but it was quite eventful. And 4 weeks down the line, and this is where we are. Stock markets from all over the world, from Japan, from Europe, from the US, very, very heavy losses. Now, what I'm going to be telling you next, I've been trying to reframe it many times, and I am not sure if I actually did it correctly, but I really hope that at some level, you can understand what I'm going to say next. Apparently, at least historically, there is a low correlation between casualties in terms of people that unfortunately die and pass away and economic would say, economic damage, economic results. And let me take you, this is a surprising and it's not nice to say, but I would like you to think a little bit about this. Unfortunately, a couple of years ago, in the period 2014, 2016, we experienced an outbreak of Ebola in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Now, the death, unfortunately, the death were about, at least in that region, in that period, 11,325. And as you can see over there, this is really about 11,325 more than the people that unfortunately had to pass away. Okay, so this is not with light heart that I say that, but if you think a little bit on the bigger scales, this is a quite not particularly big number of people that unfortunately pass away. But if you actually look at what's like the economic toll was very, very serious. $53 billion in terms of losses, and one of those countries, Sierra Leone, experienced a minus 20% in GDP in the year 2015. So once again, I don't want to sound, I'm saying this like, with full understanding of, that one person dying is one more than we should die. So this is very important. But the fact that we are seeing, let's say today with coronavirus, enormous amount of that, but definitely not in the millions, right, that we saw in the past with other things that were happening before. The economic output, the economic damage can be very, very serious. And we know that this is going to be the case. So what is the address and what is the approach that I would like to take in actually thinking about this? First of all, I'm sure that you have been seeing a lot of forecasts done by my colleagues. And I think in the past I've been part of this pool of people that actually go and trying to forecast about the future. And here there's a quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, was an economist at Harvard that unfortunately passed away some 15 years ago, that basically says the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. Okay, there's a little bit of a light assumption, a light quote, but I really believe that this is the way it is. There's a lot of things, especially with human being, and especially about the future, that are very, very difficult to forecast. And let me give you a quite quick example in order maybe to convince you if you're not already convinced. Last week, about 2 weeks ago, March 27th, in the US, there were some forecasts regarding unemployment claims for the COVID-19 applications in the US. Well, the forecast a couple of days before that, okay, would have been that only 1.6 million Americans, US citizens, would have asked for these unemployment claims. Reality is that the number was basically twice as big, 3.3 millions, all right? And that was like the highest peak since that it was not even seen in the financial crisis. So what I'm trying to say here is that, and probably you know that, these forecasts, it's a national hobby of, actually international hobbies of economists. Sometimes they do not work as well as we think. So I thought about actually going in a different direction, maybe sideways, some of you would say. And I did something different. I prepared a set of scenarios, putting together two things. On one side, what people in the profession, in the medical profession, actually would say about this coronavirus, and financial and economic implication. And I built a sort of matrix that I would like to share with you, that I would like to bounce with you in order to understand where you are in that respect. So I'm going to be talking about scenarios rather than making forecasts, right, precise forecasts. And I'm going to be starting with this paper that was actually published a couple of days ago on March 25th, 2020, so very, very recent, okay, about 12 days old, that basically in which two experts actually share their ideas about what can happen next in terms, what can unfold in terms of this coronavirus pandemic, okay? There are two professors. One is a mathematician. The other one is a professor of epidemiology and data science. So for a change, we have actually some experts that talk about what can happen next. And this is what they say. Basically, they put forward 4 different scenarios. And hopefully you appreciate that. So the first scenario, actually the first 2 scenarios, okay, to me are not exactly the same, but very similar. So what they think is basically there is a huge outbreak, which is the one that we're experiencing right now, right? As you said, as Howard said before, in New York, we are not reached at the top, at the peak of the epidemics. And after that is complete eradication. What does it mean complete eradication? Complete eradication comes from the fact that, you know, enough people get it, enough people get immunity coming from the fact that maybe they had it already, or maybe for some other reasons, they have some sort of immunity. This is a bad dream. And one day we're going to be waking up some weeks from now, and it's going to be just one thing of the past. That would be complete eradication. Then there would be something which is a little bit like, you know, not really complete, but slow eradication. All right. Now, to me, the difference depends only, like, you know, how long it's going to take for us to get rid of this very deadly and annoying virus. That is like one of the possible scenarios that we have over here, right? So this is a nightmare. We're going to get out. We're going to be suffering in terms of health, in terms of our people not being able to be with us, but eventually we're going to get out of it. The second or the third scenario, the way in which I look at this, would be persistence. These are interesting to me, interesting hypotheses that they put forward. So what does it mean? We're experiencing the pandemics exactly as we are experiencing right now, but eventually this is not going to go away. This is not going to go away for different reasons. First, maybe a vaccine or a cure is not determined, okay? And we are going to be basically we need to learn to live with this disease. If it sounds like weird to think, I mean, think about what happened, let's say, when Europeans actually went to Africa and to Americas and actually brought new diseases over there. The local population in the Americas were not ready for the new diseases, and they were dying by the hundreds, by the thousands. Eventually, let's say smallpox, I mean, it was actually brought over there in the 1400, in the 1500, and still until the 20th century, we're still actually living with the consequences of that. That is a very difficult things to think, because we have to think almost a world that move into different speeds, so to speak. There's some industry and some people, maybe some communities that manage to actually have their immunity, and some other people that do not, and they have to live with that. So it's like a very interesting, but, you know, very, 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 very interesting hypothesis. And this is the third hypothesis, which is kind of interesting as well, these recurring epidemics. What does it mean? It means that a little bit something that maybe, hopefully not, I really hope not, Howard, but really hopefully not our friends in Hong Kong and Singapore are experiencing now, and maybe, why not, in Switzerland, I'm of course from Italy, and other countries are going to be experiencing sometimes into the future. Recurring epidemics, meaning what? After the first shock, which is the one that we're experiencing over here, social distancing, all the measures that are put in place, things are going to go under control, and then eventually another pandemic is going to come out. Maybe, you know, coronavirus once again, or maybe something else, okay, a mutation of this virus, or maybe some other virus. But the point is, we would live in a world in which every now and then, not necessarily the time span that actually brought forward by the two authors of this paper, okay, but every now and then, the world is going to be basically feeling all this stuff. So at the end of the day, so this is what I would like to tell you, all right? There were 4, but I actually put 2 of them in the same choice. Complete or slow eradication, all right? This is a nightmare, it's gonna go away. Persistence, that is, a group of people, a group of countries would be completely immune or would be under control, and in other countries that will not. That would be a little bit like Ebola, right? At least the way in which I understand it. Under control in most of the world, with some pockets of difficult situation, difficult countries in which, unfortunately, every now and then, we're going to be experiencing some of this, or these recurring pandemics. That is, at any point in time, this is there, it's going to come back. All right. So now I would like to open, and maybe let me explain once again the poll. I would like you guys, okay, you're about 400 plus at this point, to tell me, where do you think we are? All right, where do you think we are? We have a poll, and I hope that this poll can be.
Yeah.
Say it again?
I'll launch it on my side. Yep.
Oh, you launch it on your side. Okay, perfect. 24% decided to actually be in the first situation, complete of slow eradication, 24%. 27% went for the second choice, persistence, all right? And then last but not least, about 50% actually of you basically thought this is a recurring epidemics. This is where we are, okay? So let me show you once again. So I hope that you can see what is going on. 24% for the first, 27% for the second, and about 50% for the third one. The third one seems to be the more, how to say, the more, the choice that you guys like the most. With this in our mind, then start thinking, like, then what happens here, okay? Well, this is what could happen. Economics implication. Now, I basically cross-reference our results of and our ideas about the different scenarios with economic implication, so to speak. Complete and slow eradication. Short period. I make a difference between banks and real economy. I'm a professor of finance, so it's really my heart really cries when I actually make the difference between financial sector and real economy. Like the financial sector is not real. But short term, financial sector, liquidity problems, of course, and real economy, sometimes severe, sometimes not particularly severe, cash problems due to the freeze in the economy. Long period, business as usual, okay? Business as usual, coming from the fact, if you really believe that this is where the economy is going, well, you will see this as a really bad parenthesis, okay? If you want, a very bad parenthesis of what actually happened, all right? Now, how long is this parenthesis going to last? Well, depends, of course, on the length of the tail. So how long is going to be taking for government actually to put on those measures in order to make sure that they have enough social distance and so on, and this is going to go away, all right? And maybe history here can actually help us and actually tell us something, okay? Sometimes I feel that, there was a colleague of mine, Arturo Briz, that would say that every crisis is different. And I believe every crisis is different. But maybe if that is the case, all right, if this is a little bit like a big explosion with nothing else after, all right, maybe economic history will tell us something. And what do we know? So if you believe that this is the case, all right, and this is going to be happening long term, depending where you are. Canada, this is the financial crisis. Canada apparently didn't lose anything in terms of real GDP growth. United States had that jump down, but then between forecast and actual was pretty much the same slope, so to speak. And then, of course, Greece, unfortunately, maybe the structure of the economy, maybe the structure of the help actually didn't help very much. Actually have a very difficult period that was not able to actually to manage very well. If you believe that this is what happens, guys, then I have to cite one of my previous colleague, Professor Peter Ricciuti from Tulane University, that in the middle, at the beginning of the crisis, actually was basically walking around and say, if you really believe that, you know, this is a financial crisis. This is the opportunity, okay, of a lifetime. If your belief is that this is just a bad parenthesis, that fundamentally long-term prospects are not very different, then you should be able actually to take advantage of what happens in the stock market, financially speaking, so to speak. This is what happened during the financial crisis. The stocks were a all-time high at 1,500, 1,400, went down to some 770, and then bounced back quite strongly until today. So obviously there was a lot of gain that could be done if you believe that this is the case. Now, of course, timing is important, okay? This is the financial crisis. Between the moments in which the financial crisis start and the real low moment in terms of stock prices, sometimes has passed, and you have to be careful in the timing. And this is not only during the financial crisis, but also the 1929 crisis, right? Interesting enough, started in 1929, but the low of the low in the stock market was actually recorded a couple of years after. So it really took a little bit for the market to really realize what is going on, okay? If you believe in the 23% of you thought this is what happens, it's going to be just a bad dream, well, this is what happens. Now, economic implication for the second thing, persistence, okay? Then this is kind of interesting, right? Because that basically means that, you know, that says this persistence to me means that there are some people in some countries, a little bit like smallpox, so to speak, you know, maybe not much of a big deal in some parts of the world, but very, very much a big deal in other parts of the world. That basically means that the world can really split down into different quote unquote silos. And the more we keep them silos, the better it is in this respect. Some countries are going to be affected. Some industries are going to be affected. All right. And of course, we're going to be seeing lower economic prospects as every now and then a country or a continent can be actually locked down and the economy will be freezed. All right. This is very difficult to manage, but the only thing which this is going to be managed is like trying to keep the two worlds as separate as possible, which is unfortunately what we do whenever we have a pandemic somewhere in the world. This is the second situation. And then the third situation that we have is this recurring pandemics. And here the problems are absolutely huge, so to speak, and for everybody. Okay, not only huge, but for everybody. There is no safe ground, so to speak. All right, this is something that is going to be recurrent, and that basically means that all our economies are going to be basically walked down to completely locked every now and then, with very little understanding of where this is going to be happening. This is what we call, Howard and I call, the end of business as usual, so to speak, right? And 50% of you actually thought that this is exactly where we are at some level. All right. Now, this doesn't have to be necessarily COVID-19, could be an evolution of that, or in the shorter period can still be COVID-19. In the longer period can be an evolution of that, or maybe some other pandemic. But the point is that every now and then we're going to be seeing our economy somehow, in this case, was like, you know, locked, shut down almost completely, and households would experience recurrent losses, cash flow problem, and freeze. And so companies will do that, right? So the three different scenarios actually over here. The first one, about 22% of you guys think about complete and slow eradication. This is the world in which we are. And if that is the case, this is business as usual, right? And this is going to go away, and we will rebuild to what needs to be rebuilt. In the other two cases, to me, is really, of course, depending on order of importance, okay, the end of business as usual. I like to think, and as the first case, the complete and slow eradication, a little bit like an injection. Do you remember when you were young? I remember when I was young, there was like, you know, these huge injections, and it was really, really painful. that was happening once, and then I felt better, and everything was just a nightmare of that particular injection. The second and third, okay, and especially the third, look a little bit more like a volcano. And here you see a beautiful picture. I don't know if you recognize the volcano. Maybe you should, given where I'm from. And this is my volcano erupting. But the beautiful thing about the volcano, of course, is very, very nice. But the bad thing is after a volcano, after an eruption, there's more likely there's going to be another eruption, and another eruption. In some extent, the world is going to come to a completely different situation. So these are, to me, how we can put together, okay, what experts would say in terms of pandemics, 4 scenarios that I simplified in 3, and what can happen, all right, in terms of ability of the world to live as business as usual, okay? Most of you somehow decided that, only 22% was like, the first case, 27 and 50%. So more of you, but nobody's right, nobody's wrong, it's just a deal, like an understanding where we are, okay, would think that this is a more serious situation, and it's very difficult to think that 3 weeks from now, 2 weeks from now, or hopefully not, 8 weeks from now, when everything, the first stage of this pandemic will be gone, we're going to come back to business as usual, okay? And Howard, hopefully, is going to be taking care from now, basically telling us, what are the options that companies can do in order to run that. Howard.
Thank you so much, Salvo, and thank you so much for all the question as we going along. And I guess Salvo's, kind of description about a volcano is very, very appropriate because it's a constant eruption of lava, meaning it's almost there is this enormous amount of problem that we face that we couldn't predict in advance. In a way that if you think for a moment, what we are facing at this particular point in time is that we are really going into a space that you may not have the complete knowledge of what you know. So this is how we think about an organizational know-how. The further on the left-hand side, the more information you have and the more know-how you can cope with the environment. So typically what happens if during peaceful time, during normal situation, you know a lot, and then you assume something like the current economic projection. The further you go to the right, the less you know as a firm, the less know-how that you can apply into the current situation. And then the more, in fact, we need to assume into our current economic environment. But the most scary bit is there is all these ignore assumption. This is what people call the unknown unknown. So the current outbreak, we are really moving into the space of a lot of assumption we don't even know how to build into our current model. It requires a new way of thinking about problem solving. It requires a new way to organize ourselves as team and organization as well. So what I'm going to do is to ask you to take a second poll before I go and outline some of the approaches or framework you can think about so that as a firm or as a team, you can take concrete action to respond to these ongoing changes that you would face. This is a poll that you can take on multiple choices. So let me walk you through the choices that you have. Essentially, I want to ask you to think about at your company, what have you been doing so far? So for those who think your company have already taken appropriate actions, support to protect your employee, including prevention and incident response, then you check your box. The second option is monitor the leading indicator on how this pandemic is continue to evolving based on health science input. So some company may do both. So you check on the 2 boxes. There is no limitation. You can check all of them. The third choice is you're going to see is engage in regulator and public health official to understand what are the current stage of your country in operation. The fourth is using scenario planning, just like what Salvo has walked you through, to project economic output. The fifth is whether your company have already stabilized your supply chain through identifying critical parts, part rationing, and optimized production location. I've been talking with a lot of car makers from Germany all the way to the US. This is pretty much a key item that they do. The sixth one is whether your company have also tried to assess the operational impact using much more of a nuanced estimation at the SKU level on the demand signal estimate, because it's very hard to predict in 3 months out, but you probably need to do on a weekly basis at a very micro level so that you can ship parts around the world. The seventh is how many of you have already communicated actively to your client and customer about the situational update of your company. The next one is stress test your finance, particularly around working capital under different scenarios. Do we have enough cash to pay our supplier or our employee? How much cash we are left with the reserve to run for your operation or in particular country? How many of you have set up a core crisis team led by the CEO with weekly or daily update? And then the last one is integrate information, because now we require very rapid responses to the ongoing crisis. Does your company have a way to integrate all this information across businesses and division and department so that you can roll up to all the information as a dashboard to make quick decisions along the way? There's a second question too in the poll. The second question I'm going to ask you is to say yes or no. Do you think your company have done enough at this moment? So I'm going to open the poll now, and then what we could do is to begin to, so I'm going to stop sharing a minute, and I'm going to launch the poll now. So you should be able to see the poll at the moment and pick and check on the one that you think your company have done, or you think your company have been responding to the current outbreak. And then the second question is, do you think your company have done enough? Again, the first question in the poll, you can do multiple choices because a lot of company would do many of them, and some of your company, for those who are even better prepared, you may have done all of them. And then the second question is, do you feel like your company have done enough at this stage? So I think people can see the result, right? Salvo, can you see the result now?
I can.
That's great. So, many of you see that companies have already done very well in particularly responding to employee situation around, protecting employee and locking incident. And as you go down there, one area is the operational impact as the SKU unit level may be falling behind. Now, it may be a little bit to do with the sector that you're in. Certainly, if you're in finance, there's not really much around the SKU per se. But
Howard, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there were a couple of questions. Maybe you can actually reply them like SKU. People
sorry. SKU is SKU. So in fact, in the manufacturing sector, we talk SKU as basically is the unit of variation of the product. Imagine you're Nestle and you're providing different packages of your instant noodles selling different countries. And each of these formats, we call it an SKU. So that would be one element among manufacturer is quite common. Now, what I saw is most of you find the company haven't really integrated information into an issue map and doing roundtable exercise. Now, this might take time because most companies may lack the infrastructure. A lot of the traditional company we talk to are still relying on a very much on a manual basis to reflect on the latest information. So hopefully over time, more organizations would invest in technologies so that you can really have all this information in hand as an integrated point of view. Because I think Salvo have already described in many ways the most likely scenario there will be episodic recurrence until the vaccine came along. So the kind of global information would become more and more important. And quite frankly, companies that invest in this type of capability today because of the pandemic, even after the pandemic is gone, they might have this infrastructure around to give them more competitive advantage to be much more of an agile company. So think about the current crisis is also an opportunity for organizations to invest in capability that are fitting for the future. Now, around the last question is almost like 50-50. Some of you think the company have done enough, and another close to half feels like the organization can do more. So how do we think about this issue? I'm gonna share with you a sort of a framework that company have been using in thinking about how can we cope with the current demand. And again, this is sort of, if you will, this is a composite, meaning we've been talking to a number of companies, and this is sort of the commonality of how organizations thinking about this issue. What we see is instead of a command control setting, company needs to cope with this emergence of very many different issues coming along. And the only way to cope with that is through an agile, discovery-driven planning, problem-solving approach. The underlying assumption is we don't know much, so we have to do situation diagnostic every other few weeks. Because as you see about this volcano metaphor, is every now and then there are new issues coming along. So we could no longer go back to the old days that we do situation analysis once every few months, once every year, and roll out a strategic plan and execute with focus. That doesn't work because the situation will be rapidly evolving. So we need to set up almost like an ongoing situation diagnosis to identify what are the biggest problems the company must face in this next few weeks going forward. It may be right now your key focus is on supply chain, but then I bet in a few months, the new focus would be client management, that your dealership are underwater. So how do we think about rescuing some of your most important account, or do we let them go? And then the next month may be around collection of cash. So it would be an ongoing reassessment. What is the company priority, all in and all out? The second step is to identify an option. Once you identify the key area that your company need to focus in the next few weeks, then is to identify and brainstorm around these option space. Now, there's really no bar hole right now because we are truly facing a new normal that a lot of the previous assumption and mindset may not fit. So it calls for creativity, that you need to not only looking at what your firm have done in the past, but really looking and benchmark across all sector. How do other companies cope with a similar problem? This is the only way that you can overcome the current challenge. Then the next phase is, of course, is much more like Salvo have walked us through predicting the outcome based on each of these options. What you want is to apply your analytical skill now to go through linear reasoning. Under this particular option, what are the likely outcomes that we are able to achieve? Then commit to your step 4 to a course of action. This call for financial resources and executional focus as well. So start with the option that the company would think have the most confidence around, then mobilize resources and execute. What you see is in each of these every steps, it asks for different skills. After diagnosis, you need to be creative. Then you need to be analytical. Then you need to have executional power, and then having administrative discipline. But don't forget, there's a huge feedback loop that you need to focus around as well. Historically, when company pick a strategy, you execute, and then it's okay. What the current outbreak demands us is to have this constant reassessment. What you do today may not work out. No one have the crystal ball. So the traditional way of thinking about the strategy through command and control and long chain of command really doesn't fit this current environment. What you need is almost thinking like a startup. But in the past, we talk about lean startup, only focus on small time product innovation. Today, even on your most core strategic issue, you need to think in an agile form. So what does it mean? Because along the way, I bet many of you would face conflicting demand. There might be demand from employees. There might be demand from customer. There may be demand from government. There may be demand from Wall Street that your investors are asking more for cash. Now, in the past, this conflicting demand won't be so poignant or salient. But today, what you're going to see is a lot of conflicting demand that you find it quite hard to balance. And I would encourage you to go back to your goal, priority, and value of the firm and try to put purpose at the core of your strategy. It's moral reasoning. It really asks for moral leadership here. Because the value of the firm is the only thing that stays unchanged. Everything around you will change, but presumably the core value of the firm would still stay relevant. So it does call for a moral reasoning capability. This is a great article that published by one of our colleagues, Thomas Malnight, on HBR, and it's a free article. If you like, go through this article and it describes how do you put purpose to the core of the business. It was written before COVID outbreak, but today it becomes even more relevant than ever. Now, I have so far talked about the process of how you think about managerial decision making. The next thing I want to describe a little bit is how you think about the structure of the organization. Now, in order for that to put that process at work, what you want is to have a core team, preferably led by the CEO, to be the crisis management team. Because in this situation, you do need someone to have the ultimate positional power to align the organization. But then it should involve a sort of larger working group, a rotating working group, in fact, because as we saw the metaphor of a volcano, every now and then you're going to face strategic issue on different parts of the organization. Today, it may be your dealership, your client, your distribution channel. Next week, it may be finance. And then the week after, maybe the spare part in your manufacturing sector. And then it's HR because of employee engagement. What you need is to have a rotating work group empowered by the CEO. And essentially, you can think about there's a long, deep bench of representatives from different functions, from different regions, from different strategic business unit, SBU, or different countries. They're on the bench so that the CEO working group can pull these people together and work through the agile discovery problem-driven planning approach to solve each of these problems as they unfold until the feedback loop begins to stabilize and another strategic issue comes along that you need to problem solve again. So for the first time, organizations, regardless of their age and size, we all need to act agilely along the way. So I'm going to close out with an inspirational example that I think today it feels painful. But over the long run, we would basically build up a type of organization that would be much more fitting to the future. And so here is a company in China being hit very, very hard by COVID, much earlier than Western firm. And it's the largest home appliance maker in the world called Haier in China. Now, interestingly enough, when all the German car makers in China were severely disrupted in terms of the supply chain because of the lack of the spare part, or Western home appliance makers were struggling to get enough supply because all the factories in China were being closed. Haier, as the largest home appliance maker, they have almost no issue. By the time it's February 2020, a few months back, the global supply has already resumed 100%. So I get really curious, how did they did that? Now, what's interesting is Haier have invested almost 20 years to work up an organizational structure that are pretty much described the way I just walked you through. It's an agile organization, but at scale. The way they did it is to fundamentally break the organization into different what they call micro enterprise. So think about instead of 2-3 strategic business units dominate the organization, they have over 2,000 micro enterprise that essentially working independently so that they can adjust the changing environment. So around this micro enterprise, on your right-hand side, you see user MU. So that stands for micro enterprise. They would essentially work with customer. In order to support this micro enterprise, there are, of course, factory, supply chain, HR, analytics. These internal functions, they would contract with this micro enterprise. So you see all this little node around the micro enterprise, those are the supporting unit. what's really interesting is the CEO of Hire allowed this micro enterprise either to work with internal capability or work outside. So if you like our internal IT solution, yeah, go for it. But if you don't like it, if you find a better supply outside, go outside. You don't need to even ask for approval. And so in a way, if you think about Hire, it's almost like an Apple app store that on top of the Hire internal app store, there are many functions that provide services for these micro enterprise. And if they don't like the internal services, they contract out. So you think about the value chain is almost semi-transparent, porous, that allow transaction to happen inside and outside all the time. So the consequences is when COVID hit China, these micro enterprises, not just in China, but around the world, make decision and think for themselves. And they can come up with a strategic plan much quicker than waiting for the headquarters to give them a recommendation. So they were the first one in China, at least, to recover the supply chain resiliency. So, of course, Rome isn't built in a day. The kind of strategic structure that you hear from Hire is highly inspirational, but it also takes Hire almost 2 decades to master that way of doing business. But now COVID have proven that it has been an enormous opportunity for payback. So if you think about the current crisis that you're going through right now, it's tiring, it's confusing, it's scary at the same time. But what you are building right now is essentially fit for the future. So I close it out with 4 elements for you to think about and things that you might consider to run with it right away. The first is try to think how you can democratize decision making. So if you're running one SBU or strategic business unit, or if you're a leader of a function, say finance, or if you're leading a country, think about how you can democratize those decision making so that your underlying, your subordinate can take responsibility to make those decisions on the ground. What do I mean by that? It's the second point. You enable these leaders to embrace what people call the single-threaded leadership. Single-threaded leadership, for those who joined last week's webinar, my colleague Mark Griffin have touched upon a little bit. Essentially, you give your leader a mandate. This is an issue you need to help solve in the next 3-4 days. Go with it. Don't ask for permission. 3-4 days, come back, show me the result. In extraordinary time where speed is everything, you need that type of autonomy. The third one is, as many area or functions are trying to work hard, you need to make sure communication is clear and transparent. So try to consider a radical approach. Record all the business unit, all the business meeting of the function that you're responsible for, and make it transparent to others. It's just too time consuming right now to do minutes and email and so on. So there are companies long time ago have already recorded all their business meeting, make it available for associate to search and use those video as almost like Q&A. The company I have in mind is not in China, but a US hedge fund company called Bridgewater. So Bridgewater is the US largest hedge fund and is run by the CEO and founder called Ray Dalio. Before internet becomes so ubiquitous, he would record all the video, put it online, and allow employees to search. This is one way to skip the sort of formal communication and allow sharing of information in real time. I think COVID basically put on this impetus to make sure the communication is real time, transparent, using technology as much as possible. If your organization already use Slack, for instance, try not to delete the chat channel, archive them, allow your employee to search key information so that people won't end up asking the same question again and again all over the place. Use a search engine smartly and wisely. We have no time to waste. The last thing is there are many digital tools that are available. Try to prioritize a small set and implement right away. Because every time you launch a new digital tool, it still takes time for manager to get used to. Pick a small set, implement quick, and go full in. So with that, I'm going to pause here and ask some questions. I'm aware of the time. We're almost overrun a minute after already. But Salvo and I are very excited to have been able to share with you. So stay safe and stay healthy. Stay in touch via LinkedIn or Twitter and check on IMD website. IMD have been building a lot of resources from different functions, whether strategy myself or Salvo from finance, and we have leadership. Check on the webinar upcoming. There are many of the activities and to continue the dialogue. And if you like our research as well, feel free to check on my website. So I'm going to close out now and pass on to Salvo, and we'll take on a couple of more questions before we close out our webinar. But thank you so much for being here. So let us open up the forum for a few minutes. Chris asked a really interesting question. Should the crisis team led by the CEO, or would it be better to give this role to the members of the lead team like CFO or COO and so on? Now, I think the key is here. You somehow need an umbrella, because again, it's a volcano situation. You don't even know what kind of information or what kind of priority you need to embrace. And this is really around the organizational survival. So even if the CEO doesn't do all the deep dive into the strategic issue, he needs to have the fully on top of the current situation. But again, it's a rotating team. So within that core team, you would have rotating member depending on the strategic priority that you need to resolve in the next few weeks. And so depending on the expert that you need, you pull those leaders to take charge through a single leadership thread, right? So it doesn't mean that the CEO needs to be the leader on every single issue, but he needs to be the member so that when there are inevitable conflict of demand, the CEO can really give the blessing, make the wisest choice based on the current value and the culture of the organization. It's truly important that we safeguard those culture when we face conflicting demand, whether it's demanding between safety and financial return and all this moral dilemma, that the core team needs to roll up the responsibility to the very top, although the expertise are subject to rotation. So I'm going to answer Michelle's last question, and then for other question, unfortunately, I really cannot answer right now. Feel free to connect me on LinkedIn, and we'll take it offline. So where does the collaboration like open source comes in? Absolutely. Right now, you cannot embrace, let me put it the other way. You need to kick out all the not invented here symptom right now, because you don't know what you don't know. And if we try to invent all the solution in-house, we're too slow, it's not going to be effective, we are going to head for failure. So what you want is to embrace open innovation as much as possible. In fact, this is the great opportunity to set aside of a parochial mindset and really go big in terms of the big idea out there. So there are many community out there, from GitHub to Innocentive to Hackathon. So participate on those, even host some of the tournament around those. I'm sure there are excited individuals to come on board to help us resolve some of the biggest humanity challenge that we are facing right now. So we are totally overrun the time now, but thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have so many of you joining us in this important conversation. Let's stay in touch, and all this video will be made available in the next few hours. You have the PowerPoint on the website. Come back to IMD website and check out other additional content and resources. As much as you learn, we are learning as well. So we are all in together. Salvo, any last comment?
No, to be honest, I really didn't follow the last couple of minutes, and I apologize, Howard, for that. I was just answering questions, fantastic questions. We will try to answer all those questions even after. And some of you actually say we will share all the slides. So don't worry about that. And thank you for being with us.
Yeah,
Howard?
Stay safe, and thank you very, very much. It's our honor to have this dialogue with many of you. So have a great afternoon. Have a great evening in Asia. For United States, it's really, really early in North America. So good morning, North America. And with that, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.